Who we are. So my name is Ann Arch. I'm the Dean of the Library at University of Portland. Lori.
And I'm Lori Burrell. I'm Associate Dean for Special Collections at the University of Arkansas.
Hi, and I'm Kristen Martin. I'm the Director of Technical Services at the University of Chicago Library.
And here's a quick outline of what we're going to do today. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about why us and why we're here and how we got to this process. Then we're going to talk about 3 big chunks from our best practices document. And these are listed here, and each of us will take a different piece of that. We are going to do breakout rooms about halfway through or so to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your impressions of the best practices document, things you think might be more exciting, more challenging to implement. And then after that, we may have time, probably not for report outs, but for at least a little bit of last discussion before we wrap up. I'm putting in chat both the best practices draft, which you may have already seen. We're still welcoming comments on it, of course, and then also the document for breakout rooms. And I will also put that in the chat later. Okay, and it's over to you, Kristen.
Hi, so I'm going to provide a little bit of background on how this best practices draft came about. So the idea for having this project team was developed organically through a conversation that began on CORE's ALA Connect space. We started with a conversation on how COVID could change the culture and the process of the all-day academic interview. As we were all participants in the conversation, we agreed to explore the issue further and come up with some recommendations that we would provide to CORE. Our charge on the slide is as follows: to examine current practices in academic interviews, for example, the length of the interviews, process for references, bias mitigation, and so forth, and to deliver these recommendations on how to make interviews a better experience for potential employees. In thinking about this, we also wanted to put forward our own background and positions, as we know, whether we like it or not, that these can shape the content of recommendations. So we are all academic librarians, and we have various levels of managerial and leadership responsibilities, and we have participated in and led searches for positions in the past. We also know, as white women, we're part of the dominant culture within librarianship, and we have tried to keep that in mind. We're not HR experts specifically, but we came to the project with our own experiences and desire to learn more about how to make the interview process better for everyone all around. We really wanted to focus on that candidate-friendly approach, and that was a theme that ran throughout this draft that we're presenting here today. And it covers issues related to bias, related to accessibility as part of that focus. We collected feedback during the late summer into the fall, and we're continuing to collect more feedback around the draft. And we encourage you to provide feedback today and to participate during this webinar. This is going to be hopefully interactive. So the first topic that I will be covering here is going to be a little bit on the concept of fit. Many of us have probably heard something like, I think that candidate would fit in really well here, or I don't think they get the way we do things. As interviewers, we may look for connections with candidates. Do they go to the same school? You recognize your alma mater? Do they come from a similar background, grow up in the same town, have a similar family? Maybe they have hobbies that are the same that you have. They seem easy to talk to, confident, charming, somebody that you just like enjoying being with their company. They just seem to get things. These might be things that come up during the interview, but are these really good reasons to hire someone? So there is some danger in going down this direction. The trouble with fit is that it becomes this crutch or a stand-in for basically how well an individual likes a candidate, and it can circumvent a more evaluative process. So instead of evaluating candidates on how well they meet the job requirements and would be able to do the job, it evaluates on how well you like them. So a focus on fit can then move away from definable job requirements and experience and easily become more about who that candidate is and less about what they can bring to the position. So this happens outside of the interview process as well. In the 2000 presidential campaign, Americans learned about the beer poll, where they were asked, with which candidate would you rather have a beer? And they picked George Bush over Al Gore as the better candidate to hang out with. As we know, Gore lost that election, even though the majority of people thought he would do a better job on the majority of the policy issues. So fit brings in this danger that it can limit diversity and kind of maintain a homogeneous organizational culture and, put some blinders on things. Because it's not well defined often, it can be very subjective, it's intangible, and it's not something candidates can really react or prepare to because it's not tied necessarily to the job qualifications or the requirements. So when we were reviewing the literature, we also saw the question, can fit be helpful? And Zan and Lori are going to talk further about some ways to improve the interview process. And many of these ways can be applied constructively to use fit as part of a formal evaluation process. This can help you make sure that you're not using fit in such a way so as to just perpetuate your status quo and limiting diversity in your organization. One of the first things to do is kind of bring things that might be under the surface to the surface. So we really recommend participating in some implicit bias training for everybody in the interview to avoid these kind of subjective evaluations and to bring any unconscious considerations to the surface. If you're explicit about your organizational culture that you want to emphasize or the direction that you want to take your organization in, then you can consider how will this position connect and support that culture and the needs of your organization instead of being indefinable and amorphous. You can tie candidate experience and their interview responses to specific job requirements and then consider how the candidate would fit in the organization, but under the specific context. So, for example, if you were thinking about having an open communications approach to something that you support in your organization, you can provide job qualifications that are looking for communication skills as a requirement. You can ask questions to assess how that candidate has approached communication in previous jobs and in other situations. And you can request feedback from interview participants where you're looking for specificity around that particular issue. And that combined with making sure that your understanding of any implicit bias that you might be bringing can really help make fit be part of the process as opposed to kind of overwhelming it and bypassing it. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Zan, who's going to go through our recommendations for how to create a schedule to support meaningful evaluation.
I'm muting myself. Okay, so ways in which to take those specific job qualifications and evaluate candidates through the process. I think many people are familiar with the idea of using a rubric to evaluate, especially at the application level, trying to look at the job qualifications and score, rate, or evaluate candidates based on the job qualifications that you've stated you're looking for in a candidate. In our best practices for interviews, we also took that to the idea of using that same sort of stated job qualifications to look at your interview day and your interview questions. So how do you structure an interview day and the interview questions you ask during that to confine your evaluations to really those stated job qualifications you said you're looking for in a candidate? Do the next slide, please. So that means really looking through that interview schedule to figure out what is necessary for evaluation. I know personally, I've always gotten to an interview schedule by asking colleagues. So I want to start interviewing a person for the first time. I want to figure out a schedule for the day. And so I'll ask my colleagues, what have we done before? Do we have an interview schedule? I don't want to make it up from scratch. And that means that we're doing the same thing every time pretty much. And what we're asking for in a best practices draft is that you look at that schedule and say, which of these pieces are really actually necessary to evaluate candidates on the job qualifications that we said were important. I'll call out in particular something like a job talk or a presentation. That's a very common part of an interview day. And for some candidates and for some jobs, it's really important to see how they get up in front of a group and speak about a topic. And I know, I've been in interviews where we do that every time. We say, okay, we're hiring for a technical services librarian, and we're going to ask what the future of technical services is and if they can give an hour-long presentation about it. But what I've found over time is the feedback that you get from that often focuses more on their ability to present, their ability to speak in public, their ability to put through some slides that are good looking and don't have any silly emojis on it. And you end up receiving a lot of feedback and evaluating candidates on aspects of their performance in the interview that have little to do with their potential success in the position, and also little to do with the stated job qualifications. If you're not hiring for a position that really is focused on ability to public speak and ability to go through a presentation, that may not be a really great part of your interview day and a very fair way to be evaluating candidates. And that can be true with many other aspects of the traditional interview schedule as well. I would also call out the ideas of meals and meet and greets. This is a really important part in some ways to make a candidate feel welcome, to make a larger group of individuals in your organization have a chance to meet a candidate. Meals are often seen, for example, lunch or dinner, to have a little bit more chance to just get to know the candidate in a social setting. However, while we really carefully structure our interview day, we carefully structure the questions we're going to ask them, we look at the stated job qualifications vis-a-vis these questions in the interview day, many of those bets are off when you come to a meal. You're subject to a lot of information about how they are socially, how they might be eating, how they're comfortable they are in those situations that, again, don't go directly to their job qualifications and often don't go directly to their ability to perform on the job, but is a lot of extra information that comes into your evaluation, whether you like it or not. I mean, I would example, if you went to dinner with a candidate, you got to know them a little better, they talked about something like their experience in last year caring for a chronically ill child. So that would be something that, they might reveal as part of a meal, but that it doesn't really go to their ability to perform on the job. And your first thought might be, are they going to be out a lot? Are they going to be, they'd be calling in sick because they have these other responsibilities? Again, not germane to their performance, but something you can't not know once you know it. And so I would say meet and greets, in my experience, has also been a way to bring in a larger group of people to be able to meet a candidate. So, you might not work directly with that person, but you want a chance to get to know them and see them before they're hired. And that's really helpful for the hiring institution. However, the one thing to think about when creating a schedule that might involve a meet and greet or something like that is how you expect the participants of that part of the day to be evaluating the candidate. So if they come to a meet and greet, they're able to see the candidate, they get to meet them, they have coffee. What information are you providing in that process that are allowing them to evaluate the candidate on the job qualifications? Or really, are they going to be forced in some ways to be evaluating the candidate on their ability to perform socially in that kind of venue? So do they make great eye contact? Do they, talk to everybody in the room? And if that's what you're evaluating them on, is that something that matters for their future job performance? So looking at each of these pieces and trying to figure out, what are we really evaluating in this situation, and how does it actually go to their future performance in the position? Okay, next slide, please. And so options might be having sessions or sections of the day that can provide that sense of welcome, can provide the candidate the ability to meet a larger group of people, but are really not evaluative. And we did it recently in a couple of ways in my organization. For example, we had candidates go to lunch with student workers. So we said, student workers, this is a lunch, this will be paid. Please make this candidate feel welcome, tell them about our organization and our library. But we did not then ask those students for feedback. So that lunch was very much some time for the candidate to relax a little bit, to get to know a few students, but we didn't then, their performance in that social situation was not then feeding back into the search committee evaluation. For meals like a dinner, there's always the option to say, we will reimburse your dinner, we will pay for your dinner, but you don't actually have to go to dinner with us. And some candidates might like that or might not like that, but giving candidates the ability to have a dinner or a lunch where they are just able to relax and not be evaluated on their performance in a meal setting could be really valuable for that interview process and give them a little space. And the other thing, what we did again in our recent interviews is we actually asked for evaluations of candidates before dinner. So we said, this is all fine. You can go ahead and go to dinner with the candidate, but evaluate them first on their interview day, and then go to dinner and have a chance to relax, have them be able to ask you the hard questions, have them have a chance to, not have to decide whether they're going to have a glass of wine or if that's going to be like, a bad sign for the hiring organization. So have that be really a non-evaluative part of the day. And if you do go that way, then having that be really clear in an interview schedule allows a candidate to understand what those pieces of the day might include. So this is a time when we're going to ask you questions and we're expecting you to answer. And this is a time when you can relax and we're not going to have that feedback into the search committee process. It's really just for you to ask questions and for you to get a sense of us and feel welcome in our organization. With that, speaking of senses of welcome, I'll turn it over to Lori to talk more about that.
Great, thanks. So as Anne has described, your interview schedule really should be intentionally developed. Another key aspect that we talk about in the best practices is the importance of sharing that schedule with your candidates ahead of time. And equally important is to make sure that you're sending the schedule out to others participating in the interview day. Oftentimes, it's really tempting to just sort of schedule a meeting, put it on someone's calendar as part of the interview day, and they don't really know how that session kind of fits into the overall structure of the interview or what's even expected of them. Why are they even being included in a particular interview session? We also recommend that prior to the interview, you should be sending your candidates the questions you'll be asking ahead of time. And at a minimum, that would be the questions the search committee will be asking. And the reason why we recommend that is we really want to strongly encourage our profession to shift away from a sort of gotcha model of asking questions during an interview. So by sending the questions in advance, what you're signaling to your candidates is that you expect them to put in some thought ahead of time and that you're looking forward to evaluating them on these thoughtful and well-intentioned responses, as opposed to how quickly they can speak off the cuff. Unless the job that you're hiring for requires that, in which case you'd want that qualification and description in your job ad, it really has no place in the interview. And we've started doing this at my institution, and I would say that there's been a really positive response both from the candidates and those participating in the interview to have those questions set aside ahead of time. Next slide, please. So as you consider what you want to include in the interview schedule, of course, you want to be sure that your candidate has a positive experience. And you also want to be sure that the schedule is structured in such a way that your participants are able to successfully evaluate your candidates. So you'll want to think about what interview format is going to be most suitable. Will you conduct the entire interview in person? And if that's the case, how will you manage the schedules of those who aren't able to participate? I'm thinking of upper administrators who may be traveling or have difficult schedules, or other stakeholders who simply can't come to campus that day. Would it be possible for you to schedule some virtual interview sessions ahead of that in-person time so that those stakeholders who you'd like to have participate can engage with the candidates? If you're considering a virtual only interview, you'll want to think about how long those sessions will be. We're all very familiar at this point with Zoom fatigue, and of course, an interview day is taxing already. You'll also want to think about the time zone of both your candidate as well as your institution to be sure that your start and end times for the day make sense and fit with both schedules. Certainly virtual only interviews can help a search process keep moving. You don't have to wait for travel arrangements and things like that. They can also be a signal to your candidate that you recognize that they may have care responsibilities or other duties that may preclude them from participating in an interview search, or excuse me, in an in-person search. Oftentimes that requires up to 3 days of time when you factor in travel and things like that. So considering a virtual option may work for some positions. A third format that we address in the best practices is a hybrid interview structure or format. And when we use that term, we're thinking about a scenario in which your candidate is in person, as well as some participants, while other participants are participating virtually via Zoom or a similar platform. And we've experimented with that a bit here at Arkansas. And from what I've seen, it's the hardest format to manage. I've seen it work really well when the sessions have 10 or fewer people in them, when everyone has their camera on, and when you can see and hear the candidate, because then it feels more like you're in a room together and having a conversation. When it's much bigger than that, there's just too much of a disconnect. So it's certainly a format to consider, but it is harder to manage. Next slide, please. So at this point in your planning, it's a good idea to do a check between the interview format and schedule you've developed, and then that evaluation rubric that Sam was describing. Of course, you want to be sure that your sessions will feed into that evaluation. And if they don't, then this is a good time to make some adjustments. You'll also want to decide who among your participants can take on a few roles to help the interview day run smoothly. And I'm going to list several different roles, but they can be carried out by 1 or 2 people. You'll just want to be sure that they know what's expected and when they'll be asked to step in. So one role would be as a meeting convener. So this is often someone in the search committee who's in charge of starting and ending each session. You'll want to be sure there's someone on hand to escort your candidate in between sessions if you're in person, or to be sure that the Zoom room is open so that they can get in if you're doing a virtual session. Another role is to have someone to facilitate the Q&A, whether that's being done in person, via chat, or both. You'll want to have someone who can be your tech troubleshooter so that your candidate doesn't have to figure out why your tech isn't working if they're in person, or if there's some other issue online. It's a good idea to have someone who can work with that person directly so that you help manage that experience. And then finally, you'll want to see if there's someone who can help make sure that breaks for your candidate are truly breaks and that they have an opportunity to do self and personal care throughout the interview day. So those are some of the roles that we've thought about. Next slide, please. So those sorts of considerations then feed into these other key components, which are listed here. And this all goes towards creating a welcoming experience for your candidates. So oftentimes hiring managers and search committees think that once they've set the schedule and set the interview date, they're done until that interview day arrives. And in my experience, this in-between time is actually some of the most critical, and a lot of important planning and thought really needs to be put into this period. So for example, have you checked in with your candidates to see if they have any questions about the interview logistics or anything else about the search? Have you reminded those participating to either send their questions in advance or certainly to come up with questions so that you're sure they're asking all candidates the same questions to help with that evaluation? Have you decided how participants and the candidate will be able to introduce themselves and give names and pronouns? Another question would be, do you have your evaluation form set up? And do you know when you'll be asking people to give feedback, what the deadline for that feedback will be? And is there time in between candidate interviews so that your participants can recharge? So just as these days can be draining for your candidates, they can also be taxing for your participants. So trying to incorporate some self-care into that schedule is helpful. So now that we've described some of the key aspects of our best practices, I'm going to turn things over to Zan, who will talk to us about our breakout rooms.
Yes, and Laura, you'll notice there's a conversation in chat about breakout room assignment, which requires your attention. So we might have to change a little bit in the plan, but so breakout rooms, what we're looking to do today is really have you think a little bit about what we've said already and the draft that we have created. And again, we can put the links back in the chat. Kristen, do you have a chance to do that real quick? And so we're really interested pretty basically in what is interesting to you about this draft, what concerns you, what you think might be challenging to implement. So we will be doing that for maybe 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of time after that to talk, and we're also really looking forward to seeing your feedback on those two documents. So Laura, you ready to?
Yep, so what I'm going to do is choose the let participants choose room option. There will be 10 rooms. And why don't we set aside room 1 for folks who identify as BIPOC, and we'll divide ourselves up that way. So I'm going to open the rooms and you should be able to join.
It's really so abrupt. It's like,
we didn't want to leave. It was so fun.
Yeah, Stephanie, sorry about that. I was interested in what you're saying, and I was like, oh, we're back. Okay, well, thanks for everybody who's back and survived the breakout rooms. We do have a little bit more time, so with Kristen's and Lori's blessing, we'll open it up to some thoughts on chat, or anyone wants to actually speak up on camera. So anybody?
Yeah, and if you would like to speak, there is a raise hand function too, and we can kind of track people that way to make sure everybody has a chance, since we do have that option with this particular Zoom setup.
I can offer something. I was in, I think, room 4, and I wasn't able to stay for the whole time, but there was some really interesting discussion about whether to send questions in advance. And it seems like maybe at least the folks in that room hadn't necessarily done that, and there were different reasons why they hadn't. So it seems like that may be an area of the best practices that is a little more challenging to think about how to implement or whether to do that.
And we talked a bit also about that same thing. And I will say that, again, as I said before, even though I'm very on board with that in concept, when we just did our recent search, we did half. So we sent some in advance, and we had some that were, and we told the candidate, in the interviews, you're going to see some of these questions, and we're going to ask another 3 or 4 surprise ones. And so, because we weren't quite ready to do the whole set in advance. So I think there's also sort of that middle ground as a possibility as well. Oh, there's a raised hand from Alex.
I just wanted to piggyback on that we were also talking about the sharing questions in advance, and right before we kind of came out of the breakout room, somebody was mentioning what is the something I thought about too. What's the worry of sharing questions in advance? Like, what are we worried about? Why aren't we sharing them in advance? And that's something that I've again been thinking about, and something that in my experience has been like, we don't share questions in advance. Like, that's just kind of how interviews happen. In the last couple of years, we have been implementing that more of sharing them in advance, but like, I think I forget who was in my group who said this, but they were talking about, what's the worry, and like, why don't we want the candidates to be successful? Like, why don't we, if we want them to be successful, like, we can share them in advance. Like, so I'm interested in what people think about like what the argument is for not sharing them in advance, because I feel like that's been a very common practice and we're shifting that, but like, I'm asking myself that too, like, why aren't we doing that?
Well, if I could say, tying back to some of the early part of our presentation, I think in a really free form interview, you don't have the questions. So that's one reason why you can't share them in advance, because they just weren't formed. And I think there's a little bit of a feeling like you're going to lose the organic conversation and you're going to hear a prepared speech, as opposed to like what the candidate really knows. So I think those are two things that I have kind of heard is like, well, we're not organized enough to come up with a list of questions, or we don't want to come up with a list of questions for some reason. And then, we also don't want to have the whole interview process be like a presentation. We want it to be a little bit more dynamic, and too much question sharing in advance could hamper that. I don't know if that came up with you, with Zan, in your recent experience.
Adolfo, I think you might have your hand up next.
I do. So I'm not going to argue against giving questions in advance. I'm actually going to argue for, because I don't know. Pretty much every institution I worked in has asked us to ask the same question in the formal interview parts of, not the presentations, for example, but in the formal interview, we have to ask the candidates the same questions. So we have always had our questions set beforehand. And so again, I don't see, well, we know the questions we're going to ask, and some of these are probably questions the candidate is going to expect. So from that standpoint, since we're having to create these questions in advance, it makes sense to give them. In terms of the concerns about organic conversation, I guess my sense is that part of the every interview process I've ever been, there's always the expectation that there are potential for follow-up questions. And so to me, the way I would address sort of that concern about the organicness of the conversation is that the response becomes a basis for follow-up questions and to me, that actually is a little bit more, you can really dive in because you really are getting you're giving the candidate an opportunity to express themselves fully, rather than trying to think of everything they can possibly do. And then in their response, that does actually give you more fertile ground to do the follow-up conversations, the follow-up questions. And then that could be your place where you sort of delve into that organicness of the situation.
To Nathan, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, and it's kind of about context that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that what is the role of the search committee in your organization, and how does that relate to who makes the hiring decision? So in ours, the search committee only provides summary evaluations of candidates, and after that, it's up to the hiring administrator and the dean to make a decision about who to hire. But there's a lot of we have a lot of policies about search committees and what we should and shouldn't do. but none of it really talks about what happens after it leaves the search committee. So that time from the search committee making their report and someone is being hired, what's happening there, and how do these guidelines impact that, right? Ideally, they should all be in some sort of agreement and alignment, but it's a bit non-transparent for obvious reasons. It's a hiring decision. You know, you can't really be too open about that, but the criteria, like what are the ADs deciding, like how are they making those decisions? And especially when they differ from what the search committee maybe was leaning towards, because we're not even allowed to recommend someone. We only provide the evaluations. So, but you know, we all kind of lean towards a favorite or something. So sometimes the outcome is very different. You know, it's like, well, why did that happen? It's just part of the mix.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, also to the point in the chat about reference checks, you know, we didn't address a lot of these kind of like outside the interview day pieces, because I agree there's like a long process in which there's a lot of need for both transparency and, you know, clear tying between, I think sort of what you're saying too, clear tie between the job qualifications and what comes through in the end. Like you should know based on what you asked for, what you decide you got, you know, so, but, you know, at least in our work, we were really trying to, again, keep things very narrow into the interview day and schedule, including not, although I think it was in our charge somewhere, not looking at like the reference check process either, which is, I think also a point of some issues as well, so. If that's what people wanted to speak in camera or mostly in chat, lots of questions. Miranda.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to this group for all the work you've put into this. I know this has been a long process. It's been very iterative. I really appreciate all the opportunities you've given people to give feedback. The question I have comes a little bit out of the conversation we had in our breakout room, which was very interesting. But it's sort of about how are you all thinking about balancing consistency and flexibility? So the specific example that we talked through a little bit in our breakout room would be if you have a distance interview, so not in person, and you want to offer it via Zoom, and you have a candidate who expresses a preference for a phone call. Is that okay? Would you make an exception for that? Or do you feel like it's more important to keep it consistent across all candidates? I feel like there's a little bit of a tension there, and I don't know if it makes more sense to come down on the side of the most important thing is to keep our evaluation consistent candidate to candidate, or the most important thing is to provide some flexibility and that kind of candidate friendliness if a candidate expresses a preference, or maybe you even go so far as to give the candidate an option to express their preference.
Yeah, Miranda, that's a great question. And I wonder if it's institution specific. And I say that because I've been told by our HR folks here that if we do phone for one, we have to do phone for all, the same for Zoom, the same for in-person. And so that absolutely impacts the kind of flexibility you can give to candidates. And I would be curious to hear from others if they are able to make some of those decisions themselves, but unfortunately here, we're just not able to.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good point. I think there may be some, certainly if there are institution level rules, like HR rules, then yeah, you'd be bound by those. Thank you.
I will just also add, we've been starting to do at least first round interviews with Candid Zoo, Candid cameras off, to try to kind of have that same kind of equal playing field if possible. So you're not judging the candidate on sort of those additional appearances or maybe Zoom backgrounds or anything else, but which doesn't completely go to your question. But I think that was an important move for us. But
Shannon, do you want to share your thoughts?
I do. I have to hop off, and I don't have a question, but more of just a comment in terms of just saying thank you for including, reminding people to include breaks for the candidate throughout the schedule. My interview for the job I have now, I remember having lunch, and I didn't get to eat lunch because they were firing questions at me. And so I was answering questions, watching them eat. And I thought, if I get this job, we'll never do interviews like this again. And so one of the things that we do is that we carve out space for the and it always confuses people, but they appreciate it once they see it. We carve out 30 minutes for the candidate to have lunch by themselves, and then they have lunch with students or faculty so that they have eaten and they are nourished, and they can they aren't focused on the fact that they're hungry. And for me, I'm diabetic, I need to eat. And they hadn't asked me about any of those needs. And so I was grateful that you put that into the best practices, because sometimes we don't think about those small things. And those small things really matter, and it really allows the person who's interviewing to have their mind really focused on the interview rather than the grumblings in their tummy. And then the other thing I think you all mentioned was doing tech checks. And that's an element that we add to our interviews, is a technology check with the candidate, where I'll have someone who's not on the search committee, one of my IT guys, to actually have a tech check, a Zoom with or Skype with the person, just to make sure that their equipment works. And the candidates tend to appreciate that too, because they get that troubleshooting. Because my guy, he's like, oh, I don't think you should do it in your car, or maybe let's try the lighting in this way. And that way the search committee doesn't know any of that, so they're not judging people off of that. And so I let them schedule a separate time, and they normally take 15 minutes to do it. And by the time the search committee sees the candidate, they have worked out their lighting, they're in a good space, they're not on their iPad, they're on a laptop, they got a backup plan. And people appreciate that, because I've been on the receiving end of that. The technology crashed, and you judge people for that, and so that takes that element away. So so thank you for that. But I'm so glad to see your best practice document.
Thank you, Shannon. Lots of chat also about appreciation for your comments.
Yeah, and I'll add, in the best practices document, we deliberately decided we could not cover all of the nitty-gritty technical best practices, but we do have some links to what we found were some representative good set of, like, you're holding an online interview, what are some things that you can do to make it run as smoothly as possible. So there's a lot of information that's out there on that. I think people have really gained a lot over this last year and a half on learning how to do that more effectively.
Alex, I had seen your hand from earlier. I don't know if that's an old hand or a new hand.
It's a still relevant hand. I just wanted to say thank you to Shannon for all of your comments. I think those should definitely be implemented into this document somehow. And I'm making notes for my own future use as well. I just wanted to ask the folks who put this together something I'm thinking about now. Like, I think these are great. It seems like these practices are mostly geared towards folks that are, you know, on the institution side of the interview process, of like, these are things you should think about. These are things you could do when you're designing a schedule and like having participants and stuff. But I put some things in the chat about like gotcha moments is something that we've talked about in our group, of like setting people up for success, the candidates up for success, making expectations clear about the interview. And I'm wondering if like this document or something similar, if any work is being done to kind of share these conversations and documents and practices with students in library programs. Like, is this, so I guess my question is like, is there any way for this document to be shared, or similar documents, with folks with library schools that are helping their students to get jobs? Like, I know that when I was in school, there was an office that kind of did a lot of mock interviews and like setting people up for success in their job search. So I'm wondering if this work can be shared with students somehow, or people that are on the other side of the interview process, candidates that are coming into the field that might not have experience with academic library interviews.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And certainly once we have what might be considered a final draft, I don't know when that will be, because we love all the feedback we're getting, but I would certainly hope that ALA will post it on CORE's website and maybe even on others. And then, yes, I think that doing some proactive outreach to library schools would be wonderful. You're absolutely right that this is written very much from like an institutional hiring perspective. My hope would be that as candidates see it, particularly those fresh out of library school, it might help them know what to ask for. I remember when I was looking for my second job, a tour of town and campus was not included, but it had been included in my first job. So I at least knew that that was something some institutions did. But I think by having, what I would hope is by having some best practices, a candidate could at least see what the profession is saying should be included as part of this experience, or things you might want to look for as you're doing your own job search. So yes, I think reaching out to newer professionals would be a really important piece to this. So we have about 5 more minutes until we get to the top of the hour. I hope that folks will continue to participate through the chat. And of course, you're welcome to raise your hand and unmute if you'd like to share your thoughts live.
Jessica?
Hi, I just wanted to ask what the next steps were with the document. Maybe you've built that into this presentation, but I was just curious.
I don't know that we have exact plan. We are still taking feedback. Our initial plan was to go to a core forum event when there was a core forum this fall. And so that was sort of like shaping our process. And since that didn't happen, we're in this sort of like feedback mode still. But our task force, I think, goes until the end of the calendar year. And so I would be hoping to wrap it up. We'd be hoping to wrap it up fairly soon, but this is really a good venue for us to make sure people are aware of the document and then start to get any last pieces of feedback. We've gotten a fair amount, but there's lots of room for more, I think. So, and Kristen and Lori, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, what we've heard today is really helpful, both in affirming some areas that, maybe we thought might be pushing boundaries a little bit, but also, some other things that we might want to highlight that otherwise weren't as strong in the document. So both those things are good. And I think we would like to kind of get this finalized and presented to the core board for their endorsement.
Thank you. And thank you for putting the document and putting this together today, and for accommodating us on the fly. I really do appreciate it. I'm always a troublemaker.
No, that worked well. And we have a Crackerjack Lori on it, so that was helpful. Jamie, do you have comments?
Yeah, I've got a question actually. One thing that has there been any discussion about recommendations for how to help libraries navigate balancing these recommendations with what their institutional HR is requiring, and where where there's a disconnect there, how to navigate that?
I can hop in real quick, Jamie. So one thing I might suggest, and it's possible you've already done this, what I discovered, and this was before we even got to these best practices and this work, is that there's true institutional policy, what you absolutely must do, and then there's the lore of what you're supposed to do as part of a search. And I found that there was a pretty big gap between those two things, and it falls under the "we've always done it this way" kind of category. So one thing I might suggest is to go to your true, central HR, their policies, their website, especially if they have search committee training. We now have to do that. And that actually illuminated a lot of this gap between practice. So that might be a great first step. And then I think, if I was going to do this on my own campus, I would try to find partners in other areas to see if maybe we could approach central HR together. I think that it would be challenging. Changing an institutional policy is challenging, but I'd be curious where we might be able to find some flexibility there. Maybe it's not a direct change, but maybe it's or you could do this kind of thing. So those are a couple of thoughts that I have.
We actually did a similar thing at my institution. Like we did a best practices like task force looking at hiring. And it's one of those things where you just have to ask HR. Sometimes the answer is, oh, you can do that. So like just ask. Sometimes you get a good answer. Like about salary, posting salaries. Turns out we could have done this all along. And so we're doing it.
Looks like we're almost out of time. So we put up the links to our best practices and Google Doc for comments and our emails for any notes you want to send us. Adolfo, you want to last comment?
Sure. Actually, I was going to say that I think core issuing a draft document like this as sort of, this is the official professional stance on sort of best practices would lend strength to us in approaching our library HR saying, hey, this is coming from our profession. These are best practices, right? And I think that would serve to actually support your arguments for changing local practices, especially when, as Anne was saying, a lot of these are actually, you know, on the fly traditional practices rather than actual HR practices. So, yay.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming today. Please continue to think about this and how you might send us feedback. Lots of opportunity to still do that. And we just really appreciate you taking the time to engage with us on this important topic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think just to verify, we are capturing the chat, and then we are also capturing the you know, anything in the Google Doc, and we will we'll figure out a way, you know, that the slides are shared as well, so that you can have those too.